Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. This time, we're going to take a look at 1960.
Okay.
A really pivotal year in the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
This was the year that you saw these sit-ins, these student-led sit-ins kind of sweeping through the South.
Right.
And really challenging, that system of segregation. And, out of this incredible wave of activism, you get a new force on the scene, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee,
Yeah.
SNCC, or as some people know it, SNCC.
Sneak.
So we're going to dive deep into the impact of these sit-ins, the unique approach that SNCC brought to the movement, and how these events kind of changed the entire landscape of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I think what's fascinating here is that 1960 really does mark kind of a turning point. You see this younger generation. There's really full of urgency, stepping up and demanding change. It's a real shift in the dynamics of the movement.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's go back.
Okay.
Let's rewind back to February 1st, 1960. Picture yourself at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina.
Yeah.
And you have these 4 black college students, Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond.
Right.
They walk in.
Yeah.
They sit down at the whites-only counter.
Right.
Now, this is, you have to understand, this is more than just breaking a rule, right? This is an act of defiance
Absolutely.
that could have had serious consequences.
Yeah. It was a calculated risk.
Yeah.
They knew they could face arrest, harassment, or worse. But they were also acutely aware that, the slow pace of change through legal means wasn't enough. They wanted a more active role in shaping their own destinies.
And it was explosive.
Oh, yeah.
Their act really set off a wave of similar sit-ins that spread across the South. It was like wildfire.
Yeah.
By the middle of that year, there were an estimated 70,000 students,
Wow.
black and white, who had joined the movement.
That's amazing.
So, that says something. It really shows you how much frustration had been building up, especially among young people who were just tired of waiting for equality.
Yeah, and this wasn't just, youthful rebellion. This was really a calculated strategy. The sit-ins were designed to be disruptive to businesses.
Yeah.
And it really forced the issue of segregation into the public eye in a way that it couldn't be ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. And these sit-ins weren't just these isolated events. They were the catalyst for the birth of SNCC.
Yeah.
Right? So just a couple months later, April 1960s, student activists, they gather at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina.
Right.
And they have this goal to create a lasting organization.
Right.
To channel all this energy from the sit-ins into a unified force.
Right. And this is where this remarkable woman, Ella Baker, enters the picture.
Yeah.
She was a veteran of the civil rights movement, having worked with both the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the NAACP. And Baker really had this vision for SNCC that I think distinguished it from those other, more established organizations.
So what was it about Baker's vision that made SNCC so unique?
Well, Baker really believed in this kind of decentralized grassroots approach. And, she championed the idea of empowering those local communities to lead that charge for change. And I think it's really a stark contrast to, the more top-down charismatic leadership style of, groups like SCLC, which is, very much reliant on the leadership of Dr. King.
Right. So instead of waiting for orders from, a central command, these local communities were actually encouraged to take ownership of their own fight for equality.
Exactly. It was about giving a voice to the people who were directly affected by segregation.
It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it seems very effective. So SNCC was all about empowering individuals and communities to take this direct action, but nonviolent action, against those injustices that they faced every single day. That must have resonated with a lot of young people, who were eager to see some actual change happening.
Absolutely. It really did.
So I imagine that the arrival of SNCC kind of shook things up a little bit within the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
Right? You have this new organization full of these passionate young people, and they're really challenging the established ways of doing things. It must have created some interesting dynamics.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
And you have to remember that even within a movement that's fighting for, a common goal, there can be disagreements about the best way to achieve that goal.
Right.
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 And I think SNCC's arrival really highlighted those differences.
So you have the NAACP,
Right.
right, led by legal minds like Thurgood Marshall,
Hmm.
and they were focused on dismantling segregation through these court battles and legal victories,
Right.
like Brown v. Board, that landmark case.
Absolutely. That was a long game,
Right.
focused on systemic change through the courts.
Then you have SCLC, which, was known for these powerful mass protests and demonstrations, often led by Dr. King.
Yeah.
The Montgomery bus boycott,
Yeah.
the March on Washington.
Rush on Washington, yeah.
I mean, these are prime examples of their approach, and they were really effective at galvanizing public support
Yeah.
and really forcing the nation to confront, the moral crisis of segregation.
Absolutely.
And then you have SNCC, which brings this fresh grassroots energy,
Yes.
right, empowering those local communities.
Hmm.
And they employed a more confrontational approach, but still nonviolent.
Right.
They were really about that direct action,
Yeah.
that community organizing, challenging segregation head on in the places where people lived every day.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, those differing approaches did lead to some friction.
Right.
There were times when SNCC activists felt that, the SCLC, despite its successes, wasn't doing enough to support those grassroots efforts, They saw resources being directed toward those large-scale events, rather than to the needs of local communities.
And there was that generational divide, right?
Absolutely.
Remember that comment by Thurgood Marshall,
Oh, yeah?
the NAACP's lead lawyer?
Mm-hmm.
He dismissed SNCC as a bunch of crazy colored students.
Yeah?
I mean, it really highlights, the tension between the established guard, right?
Yeah.
And this new wave of activists who were pushing the boundaries.
And that tension, while it was challenging, I think it was also a sign of the movement's vitality.
Yeah.
Yeah. It demonstrates that there wasn't just one way
Right.
to fight for civil rights. There were these diverse tactics, philosophies, voices,
Right.
all contributing to this larger struggle.
But even with those disagreements, it's crucial to remember that all three organizations,
Yeah.
the NAACP, SCLC, SNCC,
Mm-hmm.
they were united in their ultimate goal. Right.
Yeah.
Dismantling that system of segregation and achieving racial equality in America.
They might have had different approaches, but they were all ultimately fighting for the same thing.
Yeah, they're all branches of the same tree.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Each playing a role in this fight for justice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, the impact, the tangible impact of the sit-ins and the rise of SNCC. I mean, these events weren't just symbolic acts of defiance, right?
Right.
They really forced real change
Yeah.
in the landscape of the South.
Like, think about that Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro,
Right?
where it all began. By the end of 1961, Woolworths had desegregated all of their lunch counters
Wow.
nationwide because of this pressure from boycotts and protests.
That's incredible.
I mean, think about that for a second, A simple act of sitting down at a whites-only lunch counter
yeah.
led to a nationwide policy change
Yeah.
in a major corporation.
It really shows you the power of direct action, to actually achieve concrete results.
The sit-ins weren't just about desegregating lunch counters, though.
Right.
I mean, they were about something much bigger. They empowered an entire generation of young people,
Yeah.
and they showed them that they could be agents of change.
Yeah.
That they didn't have to wait for someone else to fight their battles for them.
Yeah, exactly.
They could take matters into their own hands.
Yeah.
And that's incredibly powerful.
It is. And SNCC really understood that power.
Yeah.
They capitalized on it by building this movement that wasn't reliant on a few, charismatic leaders
Right.
at the top.
Yeah.
But, it was about the energy and commitment of all these individuals at the grassroots level.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they took that spirit and they spread it.
And the results were, pretty remarkable. Within 2 years, sit-ins and those similar protests had led to desegregation in over 150 southern cities.
That's amazing.
That's a testament to how effective their approach was.
It is.
And how quickly things were changing.
It's really incredible. And it's important to understand that SNCC's influence wasn't limited to those initial sit-ins,
Yeah.
They went on to play a significant role in a lot of other campaigns, including voter registration drives, the Freedom Summer Campaign, especially in Mississippi.
Right. Their work in Mississippi, especially during Freedom Summer in 1964, that was pivotal because it put this national spotlight on the violent resistance that Black people faced when they tried to vote.
Absolutely.
And it really challenged the nation to look at the reality of racism in America.
Absolutely. It's hard to believe that, just a few years earlier, it was this simple sit-in at a lunch counter that sparked all of this.
And these students in Greensboro, I mean, they weren't just fighting for a seat at the counter.
Right.
They were fighting for a seat at the table of democracy,
Absolutely.
a voice in their own governance.
Exactly. And that fight wasn't just confined to courtrooms or legislative chambers, It was happening on the ground.
Right.
In these communities across the South where people were organizing, mobilizing, and demanding their rightful place in society.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great place to kind of pick up. We'll take a short break and we'll be right back.
Sounds good.
All right. So we're back and ready to kind of dig a little deeper into how SNCC, with its very particular approach, really kind of shook things up within the civil rights movement.
Right.
Now, we talked about their focus on grassroots organizing.
Yeah.
But what did that actually look like on the ground?
So, one of the things that set SNCC apart was its structure. It was very decentralized. Unlike some of those other groups that relied on this kind of hierarchy of leadership, SNCC was really about empowering those local communities.
Okay.
So almost like a network rather than a pyramid.
So it wasn't just about, a few powerful figures calling the shots from, some far-off headquarters.
Exactly. The organizers firmly believed that lasting change really had to come from within the communities themselves.
Yeah.
And so they would go into these communities, listen to the people, and help them to develop their own strategies.
Right.
To fight for their rights. It was about fostering leadership from within.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about giving people the tools
Yeah.
and the confidence to take charge of their own destinies.
Absolutely.
Now, where was this approach particularly effective?
Well, I think it's especially fascinating to see how effective this approach was in the rural South. Places like Mississippi and Alabama where racism was so deeply entrenched. And the system really worked to keep black citizens disenfranchised,
Right.
meaning, stripped of their right to vote. And SNCC organizers would go into these areas, often at great personal risk, and help people to register to vote, to organize protests, and to challenge that Jim Crow system that had held them down for so long.
I mean, that must have been incredibly dangerous work.
It absolutely was. SNCC workers faced constant threats, violence, and even death.
Wow.
But their courage and their dedication, it really never wavered. They understood that the right to vote was really the cornerstone
Right.
of a just society.
And speaking of voting rights, I mean, wasn't that one of SNCC's major focuses,
Yeah.
especially in Mississippi?
Absolutely. SNCC really recognized that voting rights were key to achieving racial equality. If black citizens could exercise their right to vote, they could begin to change the political landscape, elect officials who represented their interests, and have a real say in shaping their future.
I mean, that seems so obvious now.
Yeah.
But at the time, registering black voters in the South was just incredibly difficult.
Oh, it was incredibly difficult. I mean, there were all sorts of laws and intimidation tactics specifically designed to keep them away from the polls.
Right.
It was a blatant attempt to suppress their voices and maintain that status quo. You had poll taxes that made voting unaffordable for many literacy tests that were designed to be impossible to pass. And then, of course, the ever-present threat of violence from white supremacists.
So how did SNCC manage to make any headway in the face of such, just overwhelming obstacles?
Well, they were incredibly persistent
Okay.
and creative. They organized these massive voter registration drives. They helped people to study for those rigged literacy tests. And they even challenged the constitutionality of those discriminatory voting laws in court.
So they were fighting on, kind of every front.
They were fighting on every front.
They must have felt like an uphill battle, all the way.
Often it was. But there were some significant victories. Think about the Freedom Summer Project in 1964, for example,
Yeah.
which brought hundreds of volunteers, mostly white college students, down to Mississippi to help with voter registration and to establish freedom schools for black children who were being denied a quality education.
Yeah, Freedom Summer. It really captured the nation's attention.
It was a bold move. It brought, all this national attention to this issue. But Freedom Summer was also incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
Tragically, 3 young civil rights workers, James Shamey, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were murdered by members of the Ku Klux Klan during that summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's it's a chilling reminder of just how brutal, the reality was
Yeah,
for those who are fighting for civil rights.
absolutely. It's hard to really comprehend the level of hatred and violence that fueled those actions.
Yeah.
But despite those tragedies, Freedom Summer really did make a significant impact.
Okay.
It brought that struggle for voting rights in Mississippi into the living rooms of Americans across the country. And, I think it really helped to build momentum for the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
I mean, that was a landmark piece of legislation.
It was
It finally outlawed those discriminatory voting practices and really ensured that Black citizens could exercise their right to vote.
It was a major victory.
Yeah.
And SNCC played a crucial role in making it happen.
So SNCC's legacy goes far beyond just those initial sit-ins.
I think so, yes.
I mean, they were instrumental in transforming the civil rights movement, shifting the focus to those grassroots efforts, empowering communities, and really securing that fundamental right to vote for Black Americans.
Absolutely. They really helped to shift the balance of power in the South.
Yeah.
And what's really remarkable is that I think their influence wasn't confined to the civil rights movement. Their tactics and their strategies, particularly that emphasis on grassroots organizing, has really been adopted by so many other social justice movements in the decades since.
So even though SNCC eventually disbanded,
Yeah,
their impact continues to kind of ripple through history.
absolutely. Their spirit lives on. Their work serves as this kind of blueprint for, how to build a movement for social change that can truly make a difference. It's a real testament to the power of their vision.
Now, we've talked about their successes, but I'm also curious about, the challenges they faced internally. I mean, every movement has its own, its struggles and its disagreements.
Right, of course.
So SNCC was no exception, right?
No, SNCC was no exception. As the civil rights movement evolved and the country became increasingly polarized over issues like the Vietnam War, for example, tensions began to kind of surface within the organization.
So what were some of the sources of that tension?
Well, there were, pretty deep disagreements about the future direction of the movement. There were debates around strategy, the effectiveness of nonviolence in the face of such brutal resistance, and even the role of white allies within the movement.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine how those who are working on the front lines, right, in the Deep South, facing that constant violence and oppression, might start to question, the effectiveness of nonviolence.
Absolutely. And some SNCC members began to embrace the concept of Black power, advocating for self-determination and a more revolutionary approach, which was, very different from that initial focus on integration
Right.
that had been, really central to that sit-in movement.
So that's a pretty significant shift in ideology.
It was, and I think it really reflected the growing frustration and anger among many Black activists who felt that the pace of change was just agonizingly slow.
Right.
And that the promises of equality were kind of ringing hollow in the face of this continued injustice.
So these internal divisions, they played a part in SNCC's eventual decline.
They certainly contributed. By the late 1960s, SNCC had really transformed into a very different organization than it had been in its early days. It became more fragmented, more radicalized, and its focus really shifted away from the goals of, the traditional civil rights movement.
It's kind of bittersweet to realize, it's understandable given the context.
Yeah.
But it's also, sad to see a movement that had such a profound impact
Right.
kind of lose its cohesion.
But I think it's important to remember that even though SNCC didn't last forever, its impact on the civil rights movement and, its lasting contribution to the broader struggle for social justice is undeniable.
Yeah, I mean, they changed the course of history.
They did.
And it's truly inspiring to think about, just the courage and the commitment of all those SNCC organizers,
Yep.
They risked everything to fight for equality and justice. And their efforts really helped to, just reshape the fabric of American society.
I think that's right.
It's a legacy that continues to inspire activists and reformers.
Absolutely. Their story really reminds us that the fight for justice is an ongoing process.
Yeah.
It doesn't end with a single victory or a piece of legislation.
Right.
It requires vigilance, continued effort, and, a willingness to challenge systems of oppression wherever they exist.
That's a great point. And we're gonna kind of wrap up this episode by exploring SNCC's lasting legacy and what lessons we can take from their experience and apply to the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, that sounds great.
We're back, and it's really been an eye-opening journey exploring this pivotal moment in the civil rights movement and seeing how those actions of a few brave students really ignited a movement that transformed the nation.
Yeah, it has been a fascinating exploration.
Yeah.
And I think it's raised some really important questions about, how social change happens, the challenges of building and sustaining a movement, and, the lasting impact of organizations like SNCC.
So as we kind of wrap up this episode, I'm really curious to hear your perspective on SNCC's enduring legacy. I mean, what are some of the key takeaways we can get from their experiences? What can we learn from their successes and their struggles?
Well, I think, one of the most striking lessons is the power of grassroots organizing. SNCC's decentralized structure, that unwavering focus on empowering local communities, it really proved to be incredibly effective. And it really enabled them to build a movement that was deeply rooted in the lived experiences and aspirations of ordinary people. And I think that's a powerful concept that resonates far beyond just the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it really underscores that idea that, lasting change often begins at the community level.
Yeah.
Not, in those halls of power. It's about empowering individuals to become agents of change within their own communities.
Exactly. And I think another takeaway is that absolute necessity of courage and persistence in the face of adversity. SNCC organizers face these incredible challenges: violence, intimidation, even death. Yet they never wavered in their commitment to justice. And I think their dedication is just a testament to the power of the human spirit.
It really is. And that commitment to nonviolence, especially in the face of such brutality, it's really a powerful example of, the strength of their convictions.
Yeah, it was a core principle for SNCC, particularly in those early years. And, while their approach to nonviolence evolved over time, I think that initial commitment to it was incredibly effective in, winning over public opinion and, exposing the brutality of the Jim Crow system.
Yeah.
It made it very difficult for people to ignore the injustice that was happening right in front of them.
And it's important to remember that SNCC wasn't just about, tearing down the old system. They were also about constructing something new. You think about those freedom schools that they created, the voter registration drives they organized, and all those initiatives aimed at, empowering Black communities and creating a more just and equitable society.
Yeah.
They had a vision for a better future.
Yeah.
And worked tirelessly to make that vision a reality.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
They weren't just reacting to injustice, they were actively working to build a better future. And I think that's a really essential lesson for any movement for social change.
Right.
You have to have this clear vision of what you're striving for, not just what you're fighting against.
Yeah. And even though SNCC itself eventually disbanded, its legacy lives on. It continues to inspire countless movements and organizations that have adopted their model of, grassroots organizing and that unwavering commitment to social justice.
Absolutely. Their influence is undeniable. Their emphasis on empowering communities, their belief in the power of collective action, and their dedication to fighting for equality, it continues to resonate today. They really did provide this blueprint for how to build a movement that can truly affect change.
It's pretty astonishing to think that, a movement that started with a few students sitting at a lunch counter could have such profound and enduring impact on the course of history.
It really speaks volumes about the power of ideas and the courage of those who are willing to stand up for what they believe in, even when they're facing just enormous opposition.
Right.
And it reminds us that, every movement for social change starts with individuals. Individuals who are willing to take that risk, to step outside of their comfort zones, and to demand a better world.
So what lessons can we, in our own time, take from the experiences of SNCC? How can we apply their strategies, their spirit, to, the challenges that we face in the 21st century? How can we, like those students in Greensboro, be the catalysts for change, in our own communities and in the world around us?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's a question worth contemplating. The fight for justice and equality, it's an ongoing process. It didn't end in the 1960s. We still face many of the same systemic issues that, SNCC was grappling with: racism, poverty, inequality, and the disenfranchisement of marginalized communities.
Yeah.
That work that SNCC started is far from finished.
So it's about taking inspiration from their legacy and finding ways to, adapt their strategies to the contemporary challenges that we face.
Yeah, I think so. The story of SNCC and, of all those who fought for civil rights, it reminds us that change is possible, but it requires sustained effort, unwavering courage, and, a belief in the power of collective action. And it starts with each of us, recognizing our own potential to be those agents of change and then finding ways to use our voices and our actions to make a difference.
Well, this has been a truly inspiring deep dive. I feel like I have this renewed appreciation for the complexities of the civil rights movement and, that enduring impact of SNCC's vision. It's a story that deserves to be, told and retold, just reminding us of the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change.
It's been a privilege to explore this history with you. And to our listeners, we hope that this deep dive has given you some new insights, sparked your curiosity, and maybe even inspired you to think about how you can contribute to the ongoing fight for a more just and equitable world. Remember, as SNCC showed us, even small acts of courage can have this ripple effect and contribute to a larger movement for change. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.